as Al said earlier, these patients, it's the simple fact that there's a lot of them. It's not the case that it's a new way of being, they're pumping green blood, they're just not sort of like us, everything you knew about medicine is somehow irrelevant, and now this brave new world of figuring our way out. It's just ventilating patients, and it's because there's going to be a lot of them that we're doing all of this. So nothing that I'm going to tell you should be in any way news. I know this machine is new to most of you. Of course, some of you will have had to play with it. It's relatively intuitive. To get the patient going, so when you inherited it, hopefully in standby mode, if it hasn't been checked, Dan showed you how to check it. So we're at the stage where we can hook it up to the patient. So very briefly, I'm not going to go through this, and there's some videos available online, which I'm in trouble for. I'm running a pirate radio station now. We'll not go through this, but essentially you can't hook the HME on in a dangerous way. So this is the capnography board that we're going to use. We're not going to use, there's a little separate piece that you can sort of side stream the capnography with. We're not going to use that because there's the potential that you put that on the wrong side, and then that exhausts through the machine 50 mils a minute to air. So we're going to hook our capnography up on the back of the HME. So for the purposes of this, we're going to hook it up to a test lung in a second, which is here. I'll just set up here. There's going to be two circuits that we use. So if you put somebody off to sleep down an ED, you'll use this filter, which is a high efficiency HEPA filter, so 1 particle or less gets through per 100,000 Faraday. When we come up to the ICU, what we find is that these are paper filters, and if we use a nebulizer that we're going to show you, then these get waterlogged. So we're going to change these for the green filters that are still pretty good, 10 particles per 100,000. But remember that in terms of ejecting into the room, it's going to go through this filter and then this big bad boy filter that actually you'll have 2 filters, not 1, and then there's a 3rd filter in the machine. So actually what's coming out the back of the ventilator will be cleaner than anywhere else in the hospital. So the setup that we've got here is probably just worth quickly showing you. So it's this HME-F, for people that are doing their exams, whenever exams start again. This is a filter only, not an HME, and this is an HME. Yes, it's nice to moisturize the patient's secretions, but also this blocks less easily. Now they do still block, so it's important to know that if we've been running nebs, or this has been in for more than a couple of days, they will waterlog, as you know, and they can cause abrupt cessation of ventilation. So you need to think of, my patient's not ventilating, is it possible that this HME has become blocked and waterlogged? So you put that in your differential. This is called an Aerogen nebulizer, so this is an ultrasonic nebulizer. This little port gets opened up here, we fill it up with whatever we want to nebulize. This vibrates really quickly and then creates an aerosol chamber here that then goes into the patient. The idea is it makes the particle size sufficient such that it goes to the distal airways. Obviously that's open now, but there's a membrane here that I've been in contact with the manufacturers with, and they say that they've never detected any viral particles when they've looked at them in the circuit coming out of this. Nevertheless, what you will see, however, is the salbutamol or whatever's in there if you open this spraying out around the room. That doesn't mean it's from the vent tubing, it's just what was in this container. So this shouldn't be an aerosol generating procedure, but you'll be in PPE anyway. This little thing is the thing that we've always thrown away from the water circuit, the thing that attaches the oxygen nipple. So we're going to keep that now when we've intubated somebody and use that to connect to the water circuit. We've kind of iterated this a few times. There is a little bit of corrugated tubing that comes in this inline suction. It's rubbish, it slips off all the time, we're not going to use it, okay? For time immemorial, one of the main causes of disconnection in the ICU is those little corrugated things. This is a much more secure connection and we're going to use that, okay? Inline suction, everybody happy with inline suction, knows how it works, that's fine. Just to say that if you take it off safety and you press that down and the catheter here is in line, then it will open to air. So you have to actually physically have this pushed down, and that cap off, then it will pressurize and it will vent to air. Okay, but you're not going to do that. That's going to be left like that. That's going to be clipped, and this is going to be turned. So that's what prevents the suction catheter going down. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Fine. Ultimately, if you need to put the patient on the ventilator, don't worry about any of that. Do what you normally do. All right? You'll be in PPE. It'll be fine. But if possible, we're going to get into the way of always thinking, is my patient breathing through a filter? and try and sort of get that as a mantra of what you're going to do. Okay, so patient's going to be on a ventilator. Well, let's reach. Good. Very quickly, before you set it up, before you start it, you can decide what you want. Now, I'm not going to teach you guys to suck eggs, but suffice it to say, if you could pick volume control or pressure control as your initial mode, just because of the way that volume control works and the way that pressure control works, you will get more bang for your buck out of pressure control. PRVC is a type of pressure control. So pressure regulated volume control. So you think, oh, it's volume control. Yeah, it is, but it's really pressure control. It's just badly named. Do you want me to explain why? Do you care? No. Okay, so PRVC is pressure control. It's just pressure control that changes depending on what tidal volume you want. So I could set in a compliant lung, say a pressure control of 30/5, so a driving pressure of 25, and walk away, and oh look, the tidal volumes are 900 mils. What PRVC is you set, I want 500 mils, and the ventilator goes into pressure control mode, and just as you would do if you were sitting here going, no, I want 400 mils, no, that's 600, I'm going to turn it down a bit, that's 300, that's not enough, and turn it up a bit. That's what PRVC does. It's exactly the same as pressure control, except it feeds back based on the tidal volume you're looking for. So it just it's a work relieving thing as opposed to a fancy mode. The way to think of pressure control and volume control, if you want to conceptualize it, is volume control is a constant flow, which means that it increases the pressure over time. Won't go into it, but it means that you start blowing gently and then blowing harder. Well, if you've got a stiff lung or a stiff balloon and you wanted to put as much air into the balloon as you possibly could, you would blow as hard as you were allowed for as long as you were allowed. You would not start blowing gently and then start blowing harder. And so that's what volume control does. It just blows slowly to start with and then blows harder. Pressure control, you set your peak limit, it goes straight to the pressure limit and goes as a square wave, okay? So bang for buck, PRVC and pressure control are the modes that you want. If you want to select one mode, it's going to be PRVC, okay? So that means we change from the default mode here, so we click on the top left here, where it says volume control, and then just below here again, it says volume control here, and we're going to go and select PRVC. Doesn't really, the rest of the modes don't really matter. This is kind of the one that we'll use. And it's really simple, it's all stuff you'll know. Whenever you want to do something to this ventilator, you have to do two things. You have to press on it, so I want to change the tidal volume. I do that, then I twiddle the big knob and go down to 400, and then I click OK on the knob. Or I click off that and go on to the next thing, okay? In terms of initial settings, so it is the case that oxygen is going to be in relatively short supply, so what you're not going to want to do is to run somebody on 100% oxygen if they don't need it. So you're going to intubate somebody, and as you said, Helen, that it's somebody who you're transitioning from being just a bit ropey, who's going to need to go onto the ventilator. You don't need to have that person on 100% as a starting point. I would say that somebody transitions from a non-rebreather bag, 15 litres, so about 80% FiO2, you'd probably be looking to start the vent at 60% oxygen and then work from there. Do you need a blood gas? Age-old thing. I honestly really don't care what the PO2 is. I know what an oxygen dissociation curve looks like. You transfer oxygen to your tissues by saturated hemoglobin, so look at the oxygen sats. Blood gases, they're nice to have, but it doesn't matter. You know that if you've got sats of 96%, you know what the PO2 is going to be. You don't need a blood gas to confirm that. Yeah, maybe they've got some weird hemoglobinopathy, I don't know, but don't worry about it. You've got good sats, good enough for me. So sats are important. Titrate your oxygen down, looking for saturations, if the patient's stable, of 90% and above, okay? So the minimum amount of oxygen you can get away with to achieve that. Similarly, as Al said, CO2, you can make an argument for not measuring CO2, that there's no need to ever look at the CO2 if the patient is not acidotic. We will start saying 7.25, 7.2, something like that. But really, CO2 doesn't really matter. And we use this ethos in ICU to be called permissive hypercapnia, so allowing the CO2 to go high. And that's because ventilators, you know, cause harm. So I can take a rabbit and put him on a ventilator and give him a really high tidal volume. He's a fit, healthy rabbit, and I can come back 24 hours later having ventilated him hard, and he has irretrievable lung damage. And so the ethos of ventilators is to try and prevent VILI, ventilator-induced lung injury. There's 4 components to that. The only 2 that really matter are barotrauma and volutrauma. So giving too much volume, stretching the lung too much, and giving too much pressure, barotrauma. And so we talk about this is where the ideal body weight comes from. Now in theatres we're all pretty slack on this, but it's time to sort of tighten up and allow the CO2 to rise but protecting the lung, so doing as little damage as possible to the lung. So this is where there's 6 to 8 mils per kilo. And in terms of, looking at how tall somebody is, I mean, what I tend to do, I'm not going to go close to these patients, you'll get good at looking, are they my size, are they smaller, are they bigger? That sort of thing. And you're going to, as Al said, we're going to select sort of 2 sort of broad ranges of tidal volume. So with that, we're not going to then sort of endlessly check blood gases to try and get that CO2 where we want it to be. We really don't mind. The patient's stable, you've got good sats, you're chipping down on your oxygen, just leave it as it is. So that's really it. So in terms of starting PEEP and IE ratio, again, a starting opener PEEP is 5 centimeters of water for everyone to overcome the resistance of the circuit and the small tube that we're breathing through. I would suggest probably starting on a PEEP of 10 for these folk. They are going to have, you're going to want to recruit them. And the IE ratio 1 to 2 is fine. So that's fine. So off we go. Once we've done that, we've set what we want, then we just hit the start ventilation and it'll start to go, off it'll go. So it'll find its way in PRVC. You'll see that it'll change this peak pressure over time, over the next few breaths, to try and work out what it needs to get the, whatever I set, 400 mil tidal volume that I've set. Then in terms of fiddling with the knobs, you lift this little cover and twiddle with what you want to twiddle with. So the basic settings are on the bottom here, your FiO2, your PEEP, your respiratory rate, and your tidal volume. Bog standard, nothing fancy there. What you get comes up here. It's alarming minute ventilation low because it's not getting what I asked for, which is 400 times 10. Well, it can't yet because it hasn't had a minute. But it'll come up and now the minute ventilation alarm will go off. This is what you set. Up the side here is what you get. So we can see what our peak airway pressures are, we can see what our PEEP is, we can see what the respiratory rate we're actually getting, the FiO2 we're actually delivering, the IE ratio we're actually getting.
What's the pressure knockout on PRVC? So what should it not go above?
So you set that in the alarm limits. So if I go here, and that's a really good point actually, and I really want to draw your attention to this, and on my little Oxylog video it's the same. So frustratingly in this machine, and somewhat dangerously in my view, sorry Mackay, the ventilator will not allow you to deliver pressure beyond a pressure limit that's set in the alarms. So let's say I have a lung compliance on a patient that means that they're going to need 40 centimeters of water to deliver my 500 mils of tidal volume, right? So they're going to need 40 centimeters of water. But I've set, because I know about ARDSNet ventilation, I've set my upper alarm limit at 30 centimeters of water. Not only will the ventilator not just say, okay, I'll go to 30 and stay there, so therefore giving 400 and then maybe moan a bit that it can't get to that 500 I want, it will immediately cycle to expiration. Okay, so it'll be on its way merrily to, I think I'm going to need 40, oh shit, I've hit the 30 pressure limit, cycle to expiration. So instead of getting, not 500, instead of getting 400, you're going to get 50 mils of tidal volume. And so we can demonstrate that, and I hope this is going to work. So we're getting peak pressures. Let's go up a bit in the tidal volume. So let's say we want 600 mils now. I could fiddle with that to make the compliance worse. Fine. And so now let's go into the alarm profile. So it's needing 30 centimeters of water to deliver that 600 mils. If I go into my alarm limits, so that's up at the top here where it says alarm profile, it's currently set at 40. If I come down and set, click. If I come down and set that alarm limit to 20, let's say for the purposes of this argument, and I set, I'm getting 600 mil tidal volumes now. It's cycling to expiration. We're now getting 130 mil tidal volumes, even though the 20 centimeters of water would have given me more. And all of a sudden you will be called to this ventilator and you'll think, there's a serious problem here. I want 600 mils, I'm getting 145 mils. And nothing on this ventilator will tell you there's a problem. My peak pressures are 15, there's no problem. You put them on the bag, if that's what you're going to do, behind the filter, touch the bag behind the filter, and your bag, I don't understand, it's all fine. You would have to go, and you could go into these settings, you could go into wherever you wanted, and you wouldn't find the problem. The problem sits, really annoyingly, up in the alarms. So an alarm actually causes harm to the patient. So we go back up to 40. Exactly, but it's hidden in the alarm menu where you'd never look for it. So it's a limit. And it will immediately, and it won't just do what's clever, which is, okay, I'll go to my limit and stay there. it goes through, it hits the limit and cycles to expiration because it thinks there's a problem. So it's a real big thing, and here we are back to normal operation. Okay, and that's the major caveat. There's not 20 caveats to this machine. That's its major downfall. Okay, that's it. Everything else is kind of as normal. So that's the ventilator. How do we ventilate a patient, a COVID-19 patient, do we think? What do we do that's different? The pathophysiology here is that of a patient who's hypoxemic without their compliance being too bad. That means that we can usually use reasonable pressures to get the tidal volumes that we want. They remain profoundly hypoxemic though. We're debating in our community that our standard approach to that is to increase the PEEP, and we'll stick with that. That may turn out to be a work in progress, but in general, if you've got a hypoxemic patient, you've got two things you can do. You can increase the FiO2, well that's obvious. You can also increase something that you may or may not have looked at before, but I want you to look at now, which is this mean airway pressure. So the mean airway pressure is the arithmetic average of the airway pressures across the respiratory cycle, okay? And so if you hold that idea in your head, mean airway pressure is important, and you've done what you can with the FiO2, whenever you approach the ventilator for a hypoxemic patient, you're going to come up and say, right, my mean airway pressure is 17. When I leave this ventilator, I need to have a mean airway pressure that is higher than 17. Otherwise, nothing I have just done will have an effect. That's how you're going to increase the oxygenation of most patients who have a shunt problem, which primarily these guys do, is to increase mean airway pressure. So how do we do that? Well, if you think of the ventilation cycle as a rampart, where you've got PEEP at the bottom and peak airway pressure at the top, and if you draw a line through the average of all of that, we want to lift that average up. Well, how can we do that? Well, obviously you can lift the bottom one up, so that's the PEEP, you can increase the PEEP. What does that do? Well, if you keep the top one the same, it means that the driving pressure is lower, so that means that there's less air moving in and out. It's true that your lungs are sort of splintered open, that's good, but what may happen is that your CO2 may rise as a result of that. Usually not precipitously, and I've said I don't really care about CO2 too much. So that's one move. Looking at this rampart again, you can also put the top pressure up. Well, we've said, well, 30 is kind of your upper limit for that. We could debate, and you can go away and look at peak and plateau pressures. It's probably not worth going through here, but let's just say 30 for a peak pressure is kind of where we want to be. So we can't push that up, really. So we've pushed our PEEP up. So then we've got this rampart that you've asked somebody to draw. Where is the average of this? What you could also do is lengthen the length of time for which you're at the top one, because that would bring the line up as well. And that's called, and you know this, but I'm just sort of saying it for people that may be rusty on it. So if you prolong the inspiratory phase and reduce the expiratory phase, so you change from 1 to 2 I to E ratio to 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 1 or even 2 to 1, so reverse or inverse ratio ventilation, that's an option. What we're not seeing in the majority of the patients, and of course asthmatics will get this, people with COPD will get this, but the majority of people who have healthy lungs prior to it, it's not a restrictive physiology. So you can shorten the expiratory phase quite a lot. And indeed, we do that on the ICU with extreme inverse ratio ventilation and using a mode that's, again, a bit funny called airway pressure release ventilation. But ethos there is we've got a ridiculously long inspiratory time, 5 seconds, and then release it for half a second and then go back up for 5 seconds. Why? To increase that mean airway pressure even more. And I'm not saying you do that, but that's just the sort of ethos that we have of increasing that line. And beyond that, that's all that you can really do. We talked about ECMO, it's not going to be on the cards. And that's your moves for the ventilator. So when you talk about respiratory rate, does respiratory rate change if you draw a rampart? They are ramparts, aren't they? These other dark things, yeah, they are. And you draw a line through one that has lots of ramparts, but the top and bottom of the rampart are the same, and the width of the ramparts have the same ratio. It doesn't matter if you do this, then the line's through the middle, or you do that, the line will still be through the middle, right? So IE ratio, if it's the same, respiratory rate doesn't change your mean airway pressure. So we can demonstrate that. His mean airway pressure is 17. If I go up to a respiratory rate of whatever, well, it's not going to deliver my tidal volume, so I can't do that. Actually, I'm not going to do that. Because this will try and achieve the tidal volume in a shorter time, so push the pressure up. But suffice it to say, IE ratio doesn't change, respiratory rate doesn't change your mean airway pressure, right? So you can fiddle with the respiratory rate and expect that you shouldn't see too much change in your mean airway pressure. Fine.
Johnny, where do we, sorry to interrupt, where do we find the IE ratio again? Just
Good,
to
so I didn't
remind
show you.
me?
So
Sorry.
if we go to additional settings here, and it's up here, IE ratio.
So,
Okay.
John, is there a primer for any of this? Because obviously it's really detailed.
Is there what?
Is there a primer? Is there a document or something?
No.
You can reference?
There's a video, Johnny.
Yeah, there's this.
Can we put it into just as a summary?
We're busy, we'll try. You could do it.
Yeah.
So this is it though. This is all you need to know. I've shown you that if you go into this mode, this is all there is. Okay? So what does it say? Tidal volume, respiratory rate, PEEP, oxygen, IE ratio, rise time. So that's the speed at which you start to deliver your high pressure. You can honestly reduce that to 0, it doesn't matter. It's the finesse of ventilators, it doesn't really matter. You can safely deliver all of the inspiratory flow and pressure immediately, and it doesn't matter. And then trigger flow. So trigger flow is where the patient will take a breath. Well, the vast majority of these patients are going to be muscle relaxed, okay? So we're not going to be doing that.
So the ideal is that this is all set up before we actually intubate them, so that we plug straight in.
But you might be on D10, you might be an ED, you might be anywhere else.
I think I was just wondering about the advice that we shouldn't really be bagging them.
You can bag the patients, absolutely.
Is that
Yeah, you can bag them, absolutely you can bag them. Through this. So patients are going to breathe on the wards before you intubate them, and the people will be around them in PPE.
Yeah.
Aerosol generating procedures, of which intubation is one, will mandate you to be in full PPE.
Yeah.
And whenever the option exists to have a patient breathing through one of these, you should take it. So if you're pre-oxygenating a patient that you're going to intubate, and again, I've done a little video on this, there's a modification to the bag valve mask, which is to take the little knuckle out, put a catheter mount in, put a HEPA filter on, and then the mask on, so that whenever you're holding the mask on, the patient is breathing through a HEPA filter.
Yeah.
Now, of course, on the bag valve mask, it exhausts through that little white plastic thing. So yes, patient expired gas will go through that, but if they're breathing through a HEPA filter, it's fine. You'll still be in PPE.
Yeah.
So you'll have at least 100,000-fold 5-log reduction in the amount of stuff going through because of this. So the idea that you can't disconnect a patient is wrong. You absolutely can. And it's the same with the Octilog, it vents to air as well. So you must have this in the way of the expiratory limb of either the bag valve mask, water circuit, or the Octilog. Yeah.
If we're ready to put high peak, should we be clamping tubes before we have to disconnect them to maintain the peak, or are we not worrying about that?
So again, this is an evolution, so we're trying all of these things. So we have a very few number of true tube clamps, and they will clamp our subglottic suction tubes. What we find is that our sacket tubes, the tubes we use in the ICU, are very good. And what are they very good at? They're very good at being in ICU patients who try and bite them. And so when we put even a Spencer Wells on them, on its third click, you can still blow through it. So relying on that doesn't seem reasonable. So you will inevitably, either accidentally or deliberately, breaking the circuit, but you'll be in PPE. And remember, it's not sort of to try and reduce any exposure at all. There'll be exposure in this room,
I'm
who knows?
thinking from a peak point of view. So
Yes, so absolutely, for a poorly patient, I would say that even if you're planning ahead and you know what you're going to do, so what you're not going to do, I mean, it's not to be facetious, is disconnect them and say, right, where are we going to get that, what is it, the other thing, whatever, can we go and see if we got it? Oh, we don't have it, all right, okay, put them back on. You're going to be ready to go. Really, a disconnection of 5 seconds is not going to make or break a patient. So I wouldn't stress about that. And actually, things should happen slower, not faster in all of this. There is no mad rush. Helen, they should be patients that we can take our time about. They are not polytrauma, gunshot wounds. Of course, that may... Well, these patients in and of themselves are not that hard to manage. If this was any other business for us, compared to a flu pneumonitis, this is easier to manage for us than a flu pneumonitis. They're not in isolation challenging patients, certainly to begin with. And it is the case that we'll kind of all be around, we'll all be working closely with each other. And I don't know exactly how that's going to look. But in terms of the ventilator, that's pretty much it, okay? There's, just for completeness down here, there's additional values, so you can get some, if you want to be clever, you can look at various parameters that it will measure, like dynamic compliance, static compliance, and things like that. Don't worry about it. Key thing is that air is going in and out, right?